The topic that we'll be discussing today is reducing global talent mobility costs. To go ahead and get started, for our first kind of housekeeping items, I wanted to again welcome everyone to the call today. We will be recording this, so if there's anyone on your team that was unable to attend, then feel free to send this over to them. We'll post this on our website and also our YouTube channel. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to place them in the chat. Otherwise, you can send them to the email that you have on the bottom left of the screen. I'll give you just a moment to jot that down if you need to. Now, one thing that I like to do, it's a bit awkward, but to end up getting an introduction out of the way, the awkward portion is I always end up saying whenever you listen to a speaker, it's the resume, what gives them the credibility to end up speaking to you. So this is me, Andrew Bruzy, and I am the founder and CEO of Vendium Global. I have a couple of our support team in the room with me right now. I am an author in the global mobility space, so I've published 2 books and about a dozen articles in different platforms, a number of videos as well, and have just over a decade of mobility experience. Now, to give you an idea, if you're unfamiliar with Vendium Global and kind of the suite of services that we offer, we are a global mobility and HR consultancy firm. Now, unlike most relocation management companies, we act as essentially the intermediary. So we'll work with a lot of RMCs and corporate clients in how to build what we refer to as mobility modernized. Some of that is just looking at the picture of mobility, what you expect all the pieces are that flow together, taking that picture, tearing it up to a bunch of pieces, and replacing them into what actually fits their model. So we're headquartered in Northwest Arkansas, and part of the who do we help, I mentioned that a lot of relocation management companies and large corporate clients. Part of that is just driving efficiency with high volume. Whenever we end up having a client that may have a mobility issue, whether or not it's domestic or global, and when I'm referring to domestic, it may be domestic in Canada, domestic in Brazil, wherever their location is, we want to look at the actual challenges of their location and how we build it to best fit them. And then the how do we help portion. So again, looking at the holistic model. A lot of organizations will end up looking at just a symptom of whatever they're facing. So if the symptom is, hey, we are having a lot of cost related to our mobility program, again, the reason why a lot of you are attending today, I'm not going to go through too many specifics of reduce exceptions and a lot of the buzzwords that people will end up speaking through because we look at the bigger picture. So I can almost promise you, if I can manage to keep you awake throughout this time, and I know that it's right before lunch for a lot of our folks in the US, then you will end up hearing information that you haven't heard before, hopefully. So first of all, for what is global talent mobility? Now, any of us in the mobility space hear this a lot. This is a challenge where we'll end up having to explain what we do. Whenever I refer to our elevator speech of what all is involved in the process of a business. And we can end up saying things like, oh, we help move people, but for the folks in immigration, they're saying, well, actually we handle more of the legal side of the house. And you have people on the relocation management side or the supplier side, so building tools and all sorts of things. So what I like to refer to it as is the business enablement function, facilitating the movement of the right talent to the right place at the right time and for the right reason. Now, this is going to be an overarching theme throughout the presentation today, and I'll go back to some of these items here soon. But if you ever need to cover what you end up doing for a living, regardless of your place in the industry, this most likely applies to you because you're a part of the greater process. We all do not do every piece of it. It would be physically impossible, but we're all part of the gears that end up going into a very well-tuned clock. Now, who are our stakeholders? And you'll see that we have these divided into 2 different categories. The one on the left there with HR, recruiting, the hiring manager, employee mobility team, that's what most people end up thinking of is who our stakeholders are. But again, when we end up mentioning all of the gears in this clock, we'll have to remember that it goes well beyond that. Our stakeholders will end up going into the suppliers, legal, tax, payroll, the information technology teams of our organizations. And a lot of that has to do with the technology advancements that we're having. So whenever you're partnering with them, you need to make sure that you're speaking their same language. Everyone on this page right now has their own wants and needs and has their own goals throughout the year. So whenever we're reducing costs, we need to make sure that we're not reducing costs at the detriment of anyone on here. Now for do's and don'ts of reducing costs. Now, on the right side, there is a lot of this industry wide. And this happens a lot with corporate clients that we meet with where they're saying, hey, we want to reduce costs. We have a 10% go get. Let's go ahead and cut benefits. And so that's the first thing that they end up going for. And that's where I'm saying don't diminish employee experience or don't act without data. And when you end up making a decision, in any business decision, we want to have these backed by metrics. That's part of, again, this overarching concept that we refer to with mobility modernized is a lot of the time whenever we should have actually placed this on our first piece of what we do in global talent mobility. And I often joke that we're just as much psychologists and priests as we are mobility managers. And part of that is whenever we get a lot of noise in, they say that the three most stressful times in someone's life are going to be death, divorce, and relocation. And again, often joke that I hope that two don't happen when we're facilitating the other, but making sure that there's data behind those decisions and not just emotions, because we do care about the people that we're moving. That's why we move them. That's why we support them. That's why we're in the roles that we're in. But we want to make sure that, again, there's actual numbers to back it up. That's for a couple of reasons. A, that you end up making a good decision, make a better decision, and B, that you can back it up to your stakeholders. Because as we mentioned, those are a lot of folks that are relying on us and have different goals. You just have to back that up with data of why we did certain things or better understand their why so we can meet their needs. Now, another item, and again, just to focus in on the don'ts, because those may be more important than the do's, is do not lower compliance adherence. In a lot of cases, when we're cutting corners and trying to reduce costs, we don't want to end up doing anything to the detriment of our legal compliance and tax compliance. Some of that is hiring the right folks to support us, hiring the right legal teams, or spending the right time on development, things like intercultural training and coaching to end up getting someone to interact well with where they're going has just as much to do with the legal and social compliance of where they're going to be going as it does with, again, anything legal related or policy. Another piece is don't reduce your workforce readiness. Whenever we're looking at something to cut, HR is a very juicy target because generally we're a cost center, not a profit center. So if you're reducing your workforce readiness, that means you don't have the right talent at the right place, at the right time, and again, for the right reason, if you are just cutting arbitrarily. Now, as far as the do's, to end this slide on a more positive note, is you want to focus in on your processes. If you can end up looking at any bottlenecks that you're facing, then you can end up improving the overarching holistic machine that is your HR operations. We want to improve our people. And what that means is actually development and making sure that they have the training that they need to be as effective as possible where they are. Some of it is just making sure that you have the right selected talent for the role that they're going to be filling. We've all been in organizations that you kind of scratch your head and you say, how did this person get that job? And part of that is a bad talent management strategy or a bad job at the organization telling their story and making sure that everyone can convey value and function in the organization. Third piece is improve our technology. And that often, especially when we're talking about reducing costs, that sounds very expensive, but it's not. Improving of technology could be something as simple as adding a tool or an app, something small and relatively inexpensive that can create a big impact. And we'll go through some of that here later. Improving our tools, just as with the technology, but this is more of what I would consider essentially a workforce multiplier. This may be a policy or a way to deliver the policy, a video that you end up explaining benefit. So those are all things that applying to hopefully all of us in our respective positions in the industry. Because again, for everyone here, we have people that are on the relocation management side, we have people that are on the supplier side, service providers of every sort, also corporate. So if you have any role in that, these overarching themes should end up doing you well. Now, what are our three biggest costs? These are probably going to be different. I mentioned that I'm going to be sharing some information that you may not see very often. So generally they'll say, oh, household goods are biggest expense, or immigration. And I'm putting these again more in a category format because there is a perception that the benefits cost the most. So what happens when you're looking to reduce costs and you look at categorically, benefits are our biggest cost, let's go ahead and cut benefits. If we cut the benefits, that reduces the tax gross up that we apply. And you know what, we're just gonna say zero exceptions. I actually have clients that do this, and I think that's interesting because it will not pair well with their corporate culture. They'll say, we care about our employees, we want to support them. We have a corporate culture of performance and support and teamwork. But if you're saying no exceptions, then you're saying that I don't care what happened in your scenario. No. Now, that's obviously a lot harsher than what we intend when we say no exceptions, but that's the message that your employees are receiving. So, what I want to mention as far as the three actual cost categories, your attrition rate and your failed assignments. So, generally speaking, a global assignment will cost a company about $1 million. That's obviously very, very expensive. If you have a failed assignment, that individual, not only all of the costs that went into moving them there and taking care of them while on assignment, that essentially becomes a sunk cost. Now their morale is down and it goes into category 2 of loss of productivity. Loss of productivity does not just apply to the employee, but also if you end up having multiple people in a stream and what we talked about of improving your processes, if you are handing the same piece of information over and over and over again, and you're asking the employee for multiple pieces of information, then this will end up causing, again, a bottleneck and a lot of multiple touch points. One of the things that we measure a lot for our technical products is how many clicks that you need to end up going through in order to complete whatever task that you're doing. It sounds silly because we click everything. From the moment that we end up waking up, our phone is in our hand and we use our mouse, we use our laptops for everything. Now, if we have a larger organization, so let's say 100,000 people, and they are all doing some extra clicks, in which we'll go through ROI in a minute. Each one of those takes time, it takes effort, it brings up the opportunity cost of what else they could be working on. And the third piece, that's actually where benefits come into play. Now, I'm not saying that as a negative. That actually should be where we're spending a lot of our time and money. But there are alternatives and ways to reduce the benefit costs without reducing the employee experience. Now, I know it's right before lunchtime and I'm going to make you do some math. At least you can just follow along with me. Right here, these are some boring concepts, admittedly. But I remember when I first got my start in the mobility industry, again, about 10 years ago, I was told it is impossible to find the ROI of mobility. There literally doesn't exist. And I'm here to tell you today, it does exist. And you can end up finding it actually very easily. These calculations here are very rough numbers, and they will end up varying depending on the role and what they do and a number of other factors. And again, if you're curious for your organization, I'm happy to sit down with you and go through how we can tailor in and find ROI per role. This not only applies to mobility in general, but it also applies into the ROI of any position that you hire for. There is an interesting thing that happens with large organizations is in a lot of cases, you'll just fill a role to serve a purpose. You know that someone has always been there. And then what ends up happening is then there'll be a restructuring because they're saying, hey, that role's not needed. And someone may have forgotten some of the value that was along with that role. And when you just did the restructure, you may have eliminated the ability to perform that task. So you don't want to do that. So to go through this, I have an example here in a minute. What we want to find is, first of all, the cost per production unit. The production unit is whatever the value of the employee brings to the table. So in a moment, I'll go through what a sales manager is, just because that's easy to do. Then it's going to be the cost of the task. Now, when I mentioned measuring clicks, you can do this exact same thing for that. Is there a cost of the material? Is there a cost of the hours involved? And is there a average hourly rate? When I mentioned that we can end up being very specific to the role, we can do that if we know the exact income. Then, as far as the onboarding costs, that's going to be the hiring, training, and moving. So when you end up saying, I want this individual to join my team, we need to get them trained up, we need to get them hired. So that may be actually a cost of materials to them, of either printed materials, laptops, phones, everything that goes along with that. And then obviously, again, for the purpose of our call, is the moving portion. Next up is going to be the value generated. Now, that will be the value to the company. So whatever the value generated from that employee is throughout the entire year, and then take out the cost per production unit times the number of production units completed. Again, it's easy to look at with sales, and that's why I'll do it from a math purpose. Then finally, last two is the value to the company minus the cost of the employee is the value generated. Value generated minus onboarding costs is your ROI. Now, it sounds complicated, but again, I promise you it is not. And here is an example of ROI. Now, I went ahead and ran out some easy to calculate numbers. Obviously, these are generalization for these things, but good example. And at the top, you'll see I have a breakout of what these numbers are. And forgive the acronyms underneath, but I put those there just to make sure that it wasn't too small, and so you can end up actually seeing what these are. So cost of employee is going to be 50,000. The onboarding costs, we're saying 20,000. The value per production unit is 2,000. So this would be a sales manager. Every single sale that they bring in, there is a value of 2,000. If you look to the right of that is the cost per sale. Cost of goods for this sale is $500. So obviously there's going to be a net there of 1,500. The annual production units, we're expecting them to do 50 sales per year, and we're measuring production unit as one sale. So to find the cost of the employee, we're looking at the $50,000 for the employment costs, and then the $20,000 for the onboarding cost, then $25,000 for the cost per production unit. So that means everything sunk into having this individual perform that task for a year is $95,000. The value is going to be the value per production unit. So we're looking at that $2,000 number, right? Because that was the actual revenue generated, and then times the annual production units, which there were 50 of them. That's $100,000. So the ROI is going to be that $100,000 value creation minus the cost. What you just ended up finding out there is with mobility expenses, and you can even apply this to HR generally, that employee has a positive ROI of $5,000. The great thing about this model is that now you can also find the ROI for the next year, especially if they end up increasing. So here, in a lot of cases, we'll have relocation repayment agreements or assignment repayment agreements in the event that they decide to leave. So if you are talking about your value to the business, and again, if there's looking to be any kind of financial cuts, you will end up saying, hey, within this time period, this is what needs to be accomplished in order for there to be a positive ROI. That is extraordinarily valuable and something that I think that we need a lot more of in our data storytelling. Now, I mentioned that I would go through some actual cost savings with you, so I won't just go through the general topics, and these will be some hard technical items that you can bring back to your teams today. So the first is going to be for strategic program development. So whenever you end up looking at your program, and again, I'm purposely using the term program, the program is a much bigger concept, where that is, if you include the policies, the durations of what you choose and why you choose them, the supporting resources that you provide, and opt-in options. Then for the strategic policies, good example of this is a commuter. So any back and forth travel before the move. If you end up having to go somewhere where you know that they're supposed to be in the location, this is more for tax compliance. But again, when we end up thinking back to the business enablement, we want to make sure that there is the ability to get that person there for a period of time. This happens a lot if they have a role specifically. It differs from a short-term assignment because if they have a role specifically at that location, that's where their job is supposed to be. That's where their tax home is. This will help you, again, when we talked about do not reduce tax compliance because you're looking to reduce costs. So this would be a way to facilitate that. An assignment, obviously a temporary placement for a project. Assignments are highly, highly effective, and I'll go through this in a moment when we go through duration, but they are highly effective when we're looking at the why behind what we're doing and why we're moving someone there. So if we're not planning on keeping them there, it probably doesn't make sense to send someone for a permanent move and then expect them to either not buy a home, or they do buy a home and then expect the company to do things like cover a loss on sale. That can be very expensive. So in being intentional, you're reducing hard costs while doing a soft change. Rotation assignments, this we're seeing a lot of. These are actually very exciting. So I mentioned in the opt-in section that there's a lot of people that will raise their hand and say, hey, move me here. I'll go through that in a second. But rotations can be a couple different things. They can be you're moving groups through certain areas. So let's say if you have an office in New York City and an office in Silicon Valley, then you can establish long-term leases in both locations and send people for 6 months and then just trade. So for that helps with the development of the employee, helps with the development of the staff. In a lot of cases with the companies with different headquarters, they'll have different specialties in these headquarters. So it's an immediate value add when you can commingle those, especially when you can leverage things like a long-term lease, where you're not paying the astronomical price of a corporate apartment furnished for that period of time, and the rental cars and things like that. You can set up leases on cars, you can set up long-term leases for the house, and make sure that you have a policy attached to it. And some of that is being intentional with your business travel program. A lot of organizations are doing this right now, they just aren't tracking it appropriately. The last item on there, and again, these are just a few examples of some strategic policies, are academy policies. Academy policies are when you end up sending someone somewhere solely for training. In certain cases, they may have an international application. So let's say if you have foreign nationals that are going to school in a certain country and you want to train them there to then send them out to their respective countries. That is a complete avenue that you can go down. One of our clients had a program where they did exactly that, headquartered in the US. Any international student is coming in while in university, they go ahead and give them on-the-job training, essentially a amped up internship. And as soon as they went back to their home country, they already had training, and not just training from the organization, they had training from the corporate headquarters. So they were going essentially cultural ambassadors of the organization to all of their respective offices around the world. Then for strategic durations, whenever you're selecting the where and the why, we want to look at, are we going to be moving them again here soon? And this is an important part of staying close to your stakeholders. If your stakeholders are saying, oh no, they're going to be in this specific role for 18 months, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense for them to purchase a home. So some of this is going to be guidance that you provide. If you're doing an international move, then there's a lot of factors that will end up going into potentially stepping away from your host country, potentially losing social benefits in that origination country. And that can be a big, big detriment down the road, especially if you are not keeping up with tax compliance. So it goes into our role of the education portion of what we end up doing, both with the business units and with the employee. Then what is the minimum time in the location? So are we sending them there for too long? And this also applies to global assignments. I see a lot of clients that will send their employees out for a global assignment or do what they call a global nomad, where someone will just bounce from place to place. And if you're doing that, that is creating a lot of instability for the employee. And if you're trying to create stability by extending times, and you send someone, let's say, for a 5-year global assignment, that's going to be astronomically expensive. When we mentioned the average cost of a global assignment is about $1 million, and you start extending them for those periods of time, that could be a problem. So in balancing out what we talked about for that first one, so are we going to be moving them again? Well, The answer is yes, but we want them to have some kind of semblance of home. We can always look at how to best accomplish that for both the employee and the business. Then the last item is, at what point do we get to gain an ROI? So when we run through the calculations, and I mentioned of being able to tailor these down, then we can end up looking at actual duration, either basing on time or basing it on those production units. Then you can say, hey, after 6 months, we already know we have an ROI here. And whatever that ROI is, that ROI for a global assignment might be developing someone to replace them in that role on the global assignment. It may be establishing a new facility. It may be completing a project. If at the end of the completion of the project, we're not looking at ROI of the role, we're looking at ROI of the project and the production units that they're completing. So these are all things to consider. Then, as far as applying strategic resources, now this ends up going into a lot of the tools and technology piece, but again, in going into the why behind the what. So we want to make sure that we're reducing time spent. I mentioned reducing clicks. We can end up reducing clicks. We can reduce time moving. We can reduce time traveling. I'm on the phone or an email. We host a lot of design thinking sessions where we'll ask our clients of what they would view as the perfect relocation. In a lot of cases, they'll say, physically pick up my home and place it in another location. For those of us that have moved, definitely resonate with that, because then you'll have the sense of safety and security of everything that's yours. Because part of what makes relocation one of those 3 most stressful times in someone's life is that loss of security, that loss of community. And we want to make sure that we are reducing the number of touch points to therefore reduce the number of stress points. So if you're intentional about your processes, you can reduce the time spent. Improving morale is, again, another huge piece of this. So when you're providing strategic resources, this may be a host country guide, or again, a training that may help them interact. Intercultural training is a fantastic example of this, where when someone's going to a new country, can they interact well? Do they know where they're going? Do they know about the culture that they're going to enter into? And what kind of resources are you providing them to stay close with them on that? Are you encouraging anything from an introspective standpoint? I'll go through here in a moment of a lot more of the health aspect. Then also in saving the employee money. A lot of our clients, they don't have company discounts related to moves. They'll end up looking at, hey, we have restaurant discounts. This is great because we just leveraged our volume in this area. But what about moving boxes? Your employees that are currently moving, even if they're not a part of your mobility program, if you can go ahead and leverage those same volume discounts that you use for things like car washes, then you can use it in a company like U-Haul. And that will help people moving locally or internationally. There's other factors that go into the move, even beyond what the company is paying for and sponsoring. And then again, in saving the time. So if there's multiple touch points, we want to make sure everyone has all the information exactly when they need it. Then as far as the opt-in options, global experiences are ranked as the highest level of value amongst millennials right now. And as we just mentioned, global assignments can be extraordinarily expensive. So a good example of a global experience that we just set up for a client was folks that had a similar role in different countries, then they would be allowed to swap roles. Opt-in experiences help the employee and help the company because they typically are going to be more heavily weighted for the employee expense. But they're happy to do it because they get to go where they want it and get to do what they want. They get that, again, second bullet point of development in learning what the other person's role is, because just because you have the same title does not mean that you do the job in the same way. When I mention it helps the company, is potentially that person in the other country that has the same role does it better, or they have a different tool, or maybe you can add value to their team. So in balancing those things out, it really, really helps the organization as a whole. And again, when you have happy employees, they're productive employees. Another item is the location selection. Now, I mentioned the rotations, and rotations in the sense of trading jobs. But what if you wanted to work from a very specific location? What if you had a choice between headquarters of the company? If they have a headquarters in Paris or in London or in San Jose, then you'd be able to select where you could work from. Now, that sounds fantastic. It's more difficult from a management standpoint, but even for that last bullet point of remote workers, it's an easier item to manage than remote workers because they still have a tether back to the organization. They still have folks there that are physically on the ground. So having that flexibility can again reduce cost. And when I mentioned of morale, this is a common theme here, is what if they have a family member that is bedridden that they care for, or an aging parent? It allows them to stay close and focus in on the things that they need to focus in on rather than solely focusing in on one or the other. If you have a strong employee, a high value add employee, you don't want to lose them because of life circumstances. And that's again for the remote aspect of things. Remote workers, this actually will be another piece of information that most people don't end up saying. It's the role of the mobility team to manage those. In most organizations, HR manages them just generally. Now, the reason why I'm saying that mobility needs to is because there's a lot of compliance factors that go into it. It's not business travel. If their home location is where they're traveling to and at the company headquarters, but they're living in another state or country, then you can have a litany of compliance challenges that go along with that that you may not even be aware of. So this is why mobility should own any remote working program, and it should be a formal program in any organization. What you're doing there is you're providing them the same resources that you would to someone moving, because they have a lot of the same challenges. They're going to be coming in for meetings and staying in hotels and needing those same discounts that we mentioned before and needing the same kind of level of support. They're not part of the immediate group. So we all know when we end up stepping away for a while, and especially this is a common theme for folks on global assignments, they'll end up feeling disconnected with their company headquarters. So we want to keep those people dialed in and keep them engaged. Now, as far as improving technology, this is, for those of you that know me, know this is something that's very near and dear to my heart. Technology, I always reference, is not a way to replace human beings, but it's a way to take the robotic functions from the human and give it to the robots. So when I mentioned here with bots, that is a great example. One of our tools that we have right now is actually a very cool chat bot that you can interact with via voice. So when you are, let's say, cooking your family dinner, you can speak to Alexa and say, I would like the realtor here on Tuesday. Now, what that does is that saves an email. The bot is sending the email. That saves the person time from having to disconnect from what they're doing. I often reference it's not work-life balance, it's work-life harmony. So the more that you can harmonize the mobility process and management with that person's lifestyle, interacting in the way that they want to interact, in the tools of which they interact with. If they're speaking to Siri all of the time, then have them speak to Siri. If they are texting, have them text. These are round-the-clock solutions that can end up providing the same value as a human, if not better, because they never get sick, they never get tired, and they will always give the right answer. Better yet, they give reporting at the end of every day or every week or every month or every quarter. Now, if we had employees do that, that would end up being essentially cost and time prohibitive. They would spend way too much time focusing on those things. And that's why when we can end up taking a robot to do an administrative function like that, we can have the human connect as a human being, ask them how they're doing, check in on their family, spend the time that we don't have the time for because we spend too bogged down with busy processes. Now, as far as the operation systems, this goes into what we talked about with the sharing of information. We don't want to ask the employee for a copy of their passport 15 times. We don't want to end up asking them for things that they don't have the time or even potentially the knowledge to take. We're seeing a lot of even walkthroughs of, if you're doing a house of goods assessment now with video, we're seeing artificial intelligence have image recognition where a realtor can walk through a home and it will write the property description before they even get back to their car. Whether or not there's crown molding, hardwood floors, carpet, These are things that we have immediately right now. The tools end up going into a lot of that, interacting with people in ways that will affect them emotionally, in video, in computer-based learning, things they can interact with whenever they're available, whenever they have the time, and whenever works best. Things that they can use with their families, because it's not just the employee that we're moving a household. The reporting function is a huge, huge piece in making sure that the business leaders and any operators have the right information, and we're not wasting time generating manual reports. I used to say this all the time when I was working in a corporate role. I would tell my team, if you are generating a report and you don't think that it's needed, then stop generating it. See if anyone noticed. And that seems funny, and that seems like someone might end up complaining about it. The funny part actually was that they didn't complain, because we get so bogged down with email. So are you wasting time generating an email that you don't need to? Because when we're looking at reducing the cost of mobility, that is a cost. That's an actual cost to the organization, because your time is valuable. That's why the company pays you to do it. Now, as far as the training aspect of things, this is essential. We want to have the most educated and well-trained team that we possibly can have. This applies in all different aspects. We want them to know their role very well. We want them to know the next role very well. And we want them to be able to adapt well to wherever they're going. So I keep harping on things like making sure that they have the tools to go to whichever location that they're going in or perform whatever task. But the more computer-based learnings that you can generate, that means that you don't need to physically be sitting there and doing a training. You don't need to listen to me on a webinar, right? This is recorded specifically, so someone will be able to hit play. That's exactly what we want in our organizations, because it doesn't cost you anything more to let someone hit play, to have someone interact on a higher level. Because when you do that, you're adding value to the employee. And when we're doing things like focusing in on our attrition rates, then I say that with attrition, if you end up developing people for them to leave, you're just developing your competition's talent. When you're developing people to stay, you're developing your future. Now, for virtual reality, again, this is where my Star Trek nerdy side comes out, is right now we also have tools where they can do virtual reality training. They can end up learning a job role somewhere other than where they are. They can tour a city somewhere other than that location. So if you are setting up those academies that we mentioned, you can have a specific training facility and train people in VR with any location that you may have. And it's very simple to do. Now, going green is by going paperless. And I know this sounds silly, especially in this day and age that we're mostly paperless already, but information sharing through those operation systems is incredibly helpful. People aren't printing things out. If anyone on my team prints anything out, and I'm actually getting nods right now, they already know what I'm going to say. If anyone prints out anything, then I'll end up getting onto everyone, because there's no reason for it. I'm going to throw that paper out here in a moment anyway. Put it up on a screen. We have monitors for a reason. We have laptops and iPads for a reason. So share information through that. Digital signatures are another huge aspect of it. A lot of us have relocation repayment agreements or assignment repayment agreements or any other documents that we may have to physically put a wet signature on. Now, digital signatures are just as enforceable in most jurisdictions. Discard and donate's another huge item, because again, when we're looking at our expenses, your household goods costs are huge. So have your people look through. This will both help your philanthropic efforts of what do you not want. We all should go through a purge at some time anyway. So if you don't need that chair that you've had since college that has a bunch of tears in it, then go ahead and either discard it, or if there's something of quality, donate it. Donate your food. There's great organizations like Move for Hunger that will end up taking the food to a local food bank and actually create a positive difference. Also, by offering a furniture incentive rather than moving people's items, if you give someone the option, sell everything that you own and we'll go ahead and give you $5,000. A lot of people will end up being excited about that. And you will have a net cost savings because often you will spend more money doing the shipment than you would giving them that financial incentive. And when you aren't doing that shipment, you're saving fossil fuels, you're saving time, you're saving stress, and you just gave them cash to get brand new furniture. They're going to be ecstatic. The last item on here, and again in relation to the shipment, is crating. There's an interesting thing, and especially with the improving of technology, that flat screen TVs, you can end up going to Walmart and getting a very expensive flat screen TV. I remember the first big screen TV that I got, it was very, very expensive. It's 53 inches, and that you would need a crane to move. Now, for a few $100s, you can end up getting the same thing. It costs corporations often the same amount of money to crate as it would be to buy a brand new one. So I typically encourage clients to do one of two things. If you are going to move it, then use a mirror box rather than a crate to save money. And it won't be insured. Typically, most carriers will not insure that. But if you end up doing that, worst case scenario, do a self-insurance policy, because if you need to buy the employee a new TV, it'll be much cheaper. Now for strategic talent management. Again, this is the people section of it. Making sure that you're intentional about your talent pathing and succession. Something that I encourage clients to do, especially when they're looking at their onboarding function, is rather than ask the employee where they see themselves in 5 years, you can tell them where you see them in 5 years by their skill set, by being intentional about that. Making sure that you have the skill set assessment and development of where they're going. Look at the behavioral traits of the employee before they're moved. Because again, these translate to hard costs when you're looking at that attrition rate and failed assignments. Do a career phase analysis with them. See where they're at in their family situation. Because again, when I mentioned, we're moving households, we're not moving employees. We're sending someone on an assignment where they may have just went from a dual to single income household. Are they at the proper career phase in their life that they can do that? And part of that, again, to mention further, is the family involvement and support. They should be a part of this process. They should be a part of the trainings. If you're teaching a language to your employee, the family should learn it too. It helps them adapt better. And same thing with the intercultural piece. Also, focusing on your retention. Your retention, I cannot say enough, is one of the ways that you end up spending the most amount of money, because hiring, training, as we already discussed, is extraordinarily expensive. It's much cheaper to retain the talent and make the talent feel and genuinely be appreciated rather than hiring all new. Now, geographic selection, mentioned before on the remote possibilities, I won't speak too much into that. Is remote possible, and can you go ahead and do that? Why was the location selected, either domestically or globally? Can there be another option? And what duration will they need to be in that location to turn into an ROI? For the total wellness support, I keep speaking to things like intercultural training or language training, ways for people to interact well. We talk about diversity and inclusion. Rather than inclusion, I like to end up saying belonging, because we all belong in the same organization. The enemy is always outside of the gates, never within. You hired the best people that you possibly could, and your teammates are the best people on the planet. I know that sounds funny, and a lot of people are probably shaking their head no. But if you just keep reiterating, the enemy is outside the gates, and my teammates are the coolest people on the planet, then they will be. And when you treat them with that respect, you'll get it in return. The physical care is important too, of making sure that your physical health is taken care of, making sure that they're exercising, getting the wellness support that they need. The social aspect of it and the counseling, they kind of pair together. You can end up getting counseling services that are automated and again, digital, FaceTime with a counselor to make sure that it almost essentially becomes a life coaching aspect. Check in on how they're feeling and have that built into your program. It's a very inexpensive way to retain those high valued employees. I mentioned tethered assignments. Don't let people disconnect. Remote employees, or if they're on a global assignment, you want to keep them close. And then also transparency. Whenever you end up communicating with your employees, you'll want to have as open of a book as possible. So just closing items here. I know that we have just a couple minutes left, but I just want to mention that we do have two other webinars that are going to be coming up. One is going to be next week on crossing cultures in 2020, crossing cultures. So sorry, getting tongue tied after speaking for this long. Crossing cultures in 2020 and beyond, interacting in that diversity and belonging, and in going to other countries and interacting with people from different places and different backgrounds. The other one is going to be much more into when I mentioned my geeky passion of artificial intelligence and automation to global mobility. So that's where we'll talk a lot more in depth about how things like chatbots, predictive analytics, data storytelling can end up helping you. Thank you all so much for joining us. We really hope to see you again in our upcoming webinars, and go ahead and sign off now. So thank you again.